June 19, 2019. Rewrite your story. Neil Worthington. Licensed Unity teacher and spiritual leader at Unity of Payson, Arizona.
So I'm sure that some of you in this very room this morning have at one time sat down and put pen to paper, or put your fingers on the keyboard, or perhaps even spoken into a mic, and you've written a story. And if you've written that story, you may in fact have looked at it again and found out that that's not quite the story I want. I think I'll rewrite this a little bit. What am I? Just pay attention to me. Well, then speak. We have some technical challenges this morning, but we're going to be there. Okay. We'll go back to it. Rewrite your story.
Yeah, okay.
So you've rewritten that story maybe multiple times until you got to the point where you thought, it's a success. I've got it. And the initial story may be very much different than the last story. I'll tell you a story that I think you'll recognize in the rewritten form, but you might not recognize it in the original form. So when the light goes on, let me see the light go on for you. So in the year 1537, Petrus, I don't know if I'm saying this right, Gonsalves was born in the Canary Islands. You know where the Canary Islands are? Yeah. In the Atlantic Ocean. A little ways from everywhere else. But he was born there. And he had a hereditary condition called hypertrichosis. You know what hypertrichosis is? It means that you have excessive hair growth. It's a very hairy name. And he was, in fact, regarded as a wild man or a wild child to begin with all that hair. There's Petrus Gonsalves. There he is at about age 10. So this wild child, this wild man-child, kind of fit in with all of the stories that had been about wild men. They were kind of popular to talk about wild men. And so it was a bit of a curiosity. And it was such a curiosity that it was decided that Petrus Gonsalves would be sent as a gift to King Henry II of France at his coronation. What a thing. So this hairy child, who was somewhat of a curiosity, who was sort of regarded as an animal, and maybe even a pet, was sent to the coronation. Well, the coronation occurred, and by then, Petrus was locked in an iron cage. That iron cage was put in a dungeon. The doctors and the academics went and poked and prodded and came up with a conclusion: this is a boy with a lot of hair. Well, the king thought, still believing those stories about wild men, this boy is not capable of learning, I'm sure, but we'll give him the best education and just see how it goes. So in fact they did. And before long, he excelled above all others in Latin. He learned courtly etiquette exactly, and so it could no longer be said that he was an animal, but he still was treated like an animal. Eventually, King Henry died, and Catherine, here he is as a man growing on up, Catherine de Medici had this Petrus Gonsalves, and she thought, now Catherine was the one who often arranged marriages and brought things together, and then just executed a whole bunch of people in celebration of it. It was a horrible thing. So she thought, well, it's going to be hilarious if I can choose a wife for Gonzalez and not tell the wife about it and about the condition before, in fact, the marriage is performed. Being the queen and the ruler, she had this right, or at least assumed that she did. Well, it happened. The marriage was carried off, and it was to another Catherine, who was one of the royal court servants' highly regarded daughters. And there they are, Petrus and Catherine. At the beginning, Catherine wasn't too sure. She didn't know that the union was going to be successful. But over a period of time, she grew fond. Now, Catherine de' Medici wanted to know, what's the offspring going to be like? Maybe we can have some more royal pets around, hairy children. Well, Catherine and Petrus did have 7 children. 3 of them were normal, as we think of normal, but 4 of them did have the same condition. And so they continued their life and were married for 40 years. Eventually, they were sent on tour all over the land into other countries because of their curiosity, and so they became a touring attraction. But eventually that settled down, and the children were gifted to other royals as pets. Never did Catherine and Petrus have a normal life. So did the light go off for anybody? Beauty and the Beast. Of course, that story has been rewritten many, many times. And in fact, we know most prominently the Disney version, complete with a happy ending. So, what about you? You may not have had a life as dramatic as that of Petrus and Catherine. In fact, you may not have been subjected to many of the things that they were. But in fact, you have a life that may have been disappointing at times. It may have been, you may have suffered or have felt like you have suffered at times. And the question is, are you going to stick with that story? Or are you going to rewrite that story? So Unity's third principle. Anybody remember Unity's third principle? Co-creating with God. We say often that we are able to create our reality. We have that ability through thought and feeling to create the reality that we desire. So that's sort of rewriting the story. We're not victims of a God that's capricious. We in fact have a hand in our own destiny. And so we co-create with the divine. Are you familiar, I'm sure you are, with the Sermon on the Mount in the Gospel of Matthew? Perhaps you know best the Beatitudes. We talked about blessing. You did, Maurice, and we've already talked about it several times this morning. And you may remember, blessed are the poor. Blessed are the peacemakers, and so on. But there's another part, well, you probably know the part where the Lord's Prayer is in that Sermon on the Mount as well. But you may not remember as much the part where Jesus says, as it's reported, something like this. You have heard it said, and then he gives some bit of conventional wisdom. What I say to you, and then he rewrites that story. Tutors us in the rewriting of that story. There are 6 of those instances that he speaks in that way, in that 5th chapter of Matthew. Now you can just pick one of them. And what I'd like to do is I'm giving you the abbreviated version here, but I'd like to read that for you. In the words that have come down to us from Jesus. You have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not murder, and whoever murders will be in danger of the judgment. But I say to you that whoever is angry with his brother without a cause shall be in danger of the judgment. And then I skip forward a bit. Therefore, if you bring your gift to the altar, and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go your way. First to be reconciled to your brother, and then come and offer your gift. And this is the part I want to dwell on this morning, this next one. Agree with your adversary quickly, while you are on the way with him, lest your adversary deliver you to the judge hand you over to the officer, and you be thrown into prison. Kind of a queasy feeling we get when we read that. But let's look at this a little bit differently. Let's look at this metaphysically. Let's go beyond the normal, the usual, the literal approach to this and see what we can learn from it. The very, very important word in this is that word that you see bold in the bottom, adversary. Now, usually we think of an adversary as someone that is opposed to us, someone that is our enemy. But I'd like to suggest metaphysically that adversary may mean something just a little bit different. In fact, it means that which is a difficulty for you. So it could be a person, it could be a disagreement that you have, could be a circumstance or a situation, but it's difficult for you. It's not pleasing to you. You don't like it. And there is that adversary. In these disagreements and unseemly circumstance, what is the fundamental truth that we know? It's a truth that we recognize in unity, and in simple terms, that this God means it for good. Even that person that just gets under your skin, that situation that just shouldn't be, I ought not to have to go through that. That thing that causes you suffer. God means it for good. We also know that scripture, all things work together for good. So when we look at it in this way, the counsel to agree quickly with our adversary or with that difficulty in our life takes on a little bit of a different meaning. When it takes on that meaning, we then remember that we look within for the truth. We know that the Christ within is the authentic core and substance of our entire being. So when we go there, we find that if we have been disagreeable with ourselves, we have an option to put that up alongside that Christ within and know that it's not the truth of us. So even though the situation may be disagreeable, it doesn't mean that you or I need be disagreeable. Doesn't mean that we countenance wrongdoing, unlawfulness, abuse, unkindness. But it does mean that we look to that core within, that us, that self, and hopefully to that self with a capital S, the divine presence within, to know the truth that is beyond the appearance of the situation. If we're not able to curb our disagreeableness, we kick off a negative cause and effect sort of thing. Our disagreeableness causes more suffering. And it keeps going around and around and around. So the challenge for us as we look to the Christ within, as we look to that self with a capital S, that divine self that we are, how to initiate, get going, that cause that has the cycle of positivity instead of the cycle of negativity. We have choice in this. As we are creators with the divine, we have a choice. And so we are. Let me just share how this has worked in your way. Perhaps you'll find an application for this in your life. That is your story. So my story was this. I was born into the home of a Baptist minister and a Baptist minister's wife. And as I grew up, my mother was very hard on me, a demanding mother. There was nothing I could do to please her. In fact, when I looked at it one way, and this is the way I've told the story many times, she verbally and emotionally abused. That was my story. And I lived that story as a child, and I continued to live it as a teenager and a young adult, and a middle-aged person, and on into the time when my mother arrived to the point of 94 years of age. So you can figure I'd been around for a while too. And I told and retold that story, sometimes to anybody who would listen, sometimes to my closer friends. And it became my story. I found that other situations, other people in my life reinforced the story. In fact, they played out the same role that my mother had played. Perhaps triggered by what had happened in my youth. I just dove right in. I kept in that cycle, telling that story again and again. But there was a break point for me, for which I am grateful. In her 94th year, a friend of mine, my mother was in a nursing home in Eatonton, Georgia. I lived some 40 miles away, but a friend of mine encouraged me to visit my mother more often. I had neglected those visits because I still had that resentment. Forgiveness had not been there for her or for me. So I heeded that charge, and I began to visit my mother. And I began to rewrite that story. Grateful to her, she participated in that as well. She was suffering dementia. She didn't remember a lot of things. Well, she remembered some things way back. But we would sit in the nursing home, and it was nothing more than sitting on a couch. And she would put her head on my shoulder. Sometimes not even any words. And for me, that affected a great healing. But that didn't begin to happen until I had said, I'm choosing something different. I'm choosing to draw back from the judgment of her. I'm choosing to interact with the hurt even, and to be there with her. I have to say that didn't take care of everything. That rewrite was a big one, but the rewrites continue. She's now passed 4 years ago. But the rewrites continue, and they work themselves out in my interactions with other people that maybe what happened as a child just triggers those things for me. So that is the challenge, to continue the rewrite. The cause that began when I made a choice to go and be with Mom, I didn't want to, ended up in an effect of love from my mother that I had never experienced before in my life. The ability for me to say, she did as we all do, the very best she could with what she had to work with. So that's one experience. But I suggest that for you, there are stories that you've written and rehearsed and told over and over again that could stand some rewriting. So I want to give you, how do we do that is the question. I want to give you a couple of suggestions on how to do that. Rewriting an unsatisfactory story. First one is to ask this question. Knowing that all is good, that all things work together for good, God means it for good. What is the gift of my story? What did I learn in that story? How do I have new opportunity because of that story? Look at that. And then choose wisely. How can I play it out differently? One of our powers, if you go over to the rose garden that's on the wall there, is the power of imagination. Anybody ever familiar with lucid dreaming? Come on, a couple of nods here, Dad. Lucid dreaming, an idea that when you dream something that you don't like, it's kind of like nightmarish or makes you feel awful, you can wake from that dream and then re-enter the dream with choice that changes the outcome of that dream. The same is true here. In this story that we tell ourselves, we re-enter the story in imagination and choose a different outcome. Thirdly, visualize the situation and interact with it. Can you put yourself back almost like in an action thing and interact with that story that was unsatisfactory, that was hurtful, that was painful? Can you put yourself back there? And can you allow yourself to feel it? Can you interact with it? Can you know that it hurts? Can you say that it hurts? Can you look for support? Can you interact? Knowing your feelings. Discovering your needs and moving on to choices to change that. But you may also need a trusted friend or a counselor to help you work through this. So I recommend today that you take one of these points, may be helpful to you, apply it to your story, the one you told over and over again, the one that badly needs rewriting. So then, you're not doomed to live out your inherited story. The adversary, that disagreeable thing, doesn't have to meet up with a disagreeable you. You can change that. You can interact with that. You can work through that. You can choose right and think right. You can bring feeling along. And you can rewrite your story. And so it is.